good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to another episode of Better Place, Talking International Law with me, Jonathan Coleb, Senior Lecturer in International Law at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. Today, I am absolutely chuffed to have with me an old mentor, an old friend, an old boss, Sarah Leah Whitson, a force of nature for anyone who knows her will testify to that too. A force of nature in human rights, the universe of human rights, and in particular human rights advocacy. A former Wall Street banker, former New York lawyer, turned into one of the leaders of Human Rights Watch for over a decade. Sarah Leah, welcome.
Thank you, and great to see you, Jonathan, and great to see you still in the international law field, in the human rights field. It's really wonderful.
They never let us go. And where are you joining us from today, Sarah Leah? Are you in New York?
I'm actually in New Jersey, on the countryside, lakefront.
Yeah, idyllic. And you're surviving lockdown? Or COVID, I should say, in general?
There's I mean, it's been actually personally a nice respite from having to travel all the time and commute and get dressed in the morning. So it's actually been personally nice to have that extra time with my family and in my own home.
Yeah, awesome. And so many people, these high achieving people that I'm so jealous of, seem to have taken on COVID hobbies and learnt new languages and whatnot this year. Have you done anything similar? What's distracting you under COVID?
I mean, the only thing I get to do more of that I already love doing is cooking and baking. So I've had a chance to try out some recipes that require you to be there in person. So that's really been the best time to do that.
Awesome. Sarah Leah, with your permission, I want to share with the viewers and listeners a little bit more of a formal bio introduction to you, for them to have a taste of who you are and what you've done, and then we'll get stuck in, if that's all right.
Sure.
Sarah Leah Whitson is an American human rights lawyer and advocate. She has worked and volunteered for various civil society organizations, including the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, the Center for Economic and Social Rights, and for Human Rights Watch for over a decade. Earlier in 2020, she left her position as Executive Director of the Middle East and North Africa Division of Human Rights Watch, and has now taken up a leadership role at a new organization called Dawn, an organization advocating for democracy and human rights in the Arab world. Prior to her human rights work, Sarah Leah worked for Goldman Sachs as an investment banker and as a lawyer for a prominent New York law firm. Sarah Leah is a graduate of Cal, UC Berkeley, and Harvard Law, where I believe one of your classmates was a young Barack Obama. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to leave the formal bio at that. Did I miss anything? Do you need to correct anything?
No, that sounds like a good bio.
Okay, so I mean, we'll unpack that CV. So much to ask about. The obligatory follow-up question after such a decades-long stellar career in human rights is what's your favorite ice cream flavor?
Ooh, peanut butter chocolate.
No, really? What does that even mean?
Mm-hmm. Peanut butter chocolate is the best flavor of ice cream. It's that salty, sweet combination.
Oh, I've never even heard of that. So chocolate ice cream with bits of peanut butter.
It's so good. Try it at home.
I shall. Thank you for that. Now, you've done a lot, and I guess I think it's a 16-year tenure at Human Rights Watch really does stand out from an international law and a human rights perspective. So, we'll definitely get to that. But I'm curious, what career accomplishments are you most proud of?
Well, certainly the career accomplishment that I'm most proud of is my work at Human Rights Watch. It was the main job I had where my values were so closely aligned with my work. When I was working at Goldman Sachs, when I was working at Cleary Gottlieb, I really didn't care at all about the work that I was doing. I actually had not much interest at all in the projects that I was working on, the deals that I was working on. And I can certainly do them competently and perhaps even take a technical interest in some of the matters. There'd be a feeling of accomplishment because you could actually finish projects, but I had no personal interest in them. And to be in a job where I was working in issues that I was personally passionate about and cared about, and feeling that I was standing for what I believed in, working to help others, to give voice to others, to their experiences, was just a great feeling, and one where I never had to question what I was doing when I woke up in the morning.
I dare, so you must have been living a very comfortable life, shall we say? Presumably a really nice salary, a nice gig, job security, no death threats when working at as an investment banker or a New York lawyer. So what prompted the change? How do you jump from that comfortable existence on the up and up in Manhattan life and lifestyle to becoming a human rights advocate? Was it then? I think Human Rights Watch was a pretty young organization when you joined.
It was certainly much younger. I was much younger and had, I think, about 100 or 150 people on staff versus the around 500 there are today. So it was certainly a much smaller organization. I would say that I really had George Bush to thank for it. I've often credited him for my career change because it became impossible for me with the war in Iraq, with the start of the war in Iraq, to continue my day job in investment banking with everything that was going around me. And I was particularly infuriated that my colleagues at Goldman Sachs, barely even had an opinion about it. Or if they did, it was just a side thought or casual thought. And I couldn't do that. I felt like this was the most important thing that was happening in my country, with my name attached to it as a US taxpayer, as a US voter. And I couldn't just sit by and watch what was happening. So, George Bush forced me to leave my job in the banking world and to take on a more direct role in working on the issues that I thought mattered deeply to me personally, but mattered deeply to my country. I mean, if you're not going to speak out and become actively engaged when your country is going to war on false pretenses, literally killing people in another country on false pretenses, then what is it going to take to personally motivate you to become involved? And that's not to say everybody should be a human rights activist, but it is to say that I was particularly disappointed in colleagues who, just checked out. It was just like reading the news for them. It didn't affect them, and so it didn't matter. And I realized I could not fit in that environment anymore.
But
so that was really it.
Sarah Lee, though, can I push you though on that? Because even well-meaning people, I saw the invasion of Iraq and they protested, or they wrote letters. They didn't quit their jobs and go join a human rights organization. So I guess was there an epiphany moment for you? I mean, did you wake up one day and just sort of said, enough? I have to do this, or?
It's sort of the intersection of where you are personally and professionally and the opportunities that arise and the circumstances that present themselves. So in a sense, it was that perfect storm with a war in Iraq, and Iraq is a country I had been working in from my law school days during the first Gulf War. So I was, something that was personally very invested in and outraged by. And while I had managed to remain active in the human rights field with human rights organizations on a pro bono basis at my law firm, that wasn't really feasible when I was in the investment banking world. And in fact, when I went back to Iraq on my vacation time, on my personal time with a human rights organization, in what at the time was a last-ditch effort to stop the war, to prevent the war, by getting Jimmy Carter and Nelson Mandela to come and negotiate a diplomatic solution to the showdown between the US and Iraq at the time. When I came back, that elicited criticism and, hand-wringing among my superiors at Goldman, who were very nervous that this would become known somehow.
Yeah.
And for me, I just, that was just more important to me.
Yeah.
And the job at Human Rights Watch opened up, and my friends and my family said, what are you waiting for? At least try to see what happens and apply to the job.
Yeah,
and I did.
So it was literally just a
it's
job ad out there, and you just sent in your CV and cover
Well,
letter.
I had some friends at Human Rights Watch who, emailed me or contacted me. I don't know what we did in that day, to say, in fact, it was Reed Brody, who is the dictator hunter and should be a great person to be talking to in terms of being an amazing international lawyer, who alerted me to the position and said, you should apply. And my husband encouraged me, and so on. And, I can't say I was really, it was certainly hard to give up my salary and the accompanying perks and security at a place like Goldman Sachs. But that was never really my motivation. In being in that job, I certainly wanted to pay off my law school debts and get some financial security, but I was never, aiming to be a master of the universe, or my goal was never to accumulate as much wealth as possible. Although my shoe budget did take a hit, and that was pretty sad, but I have survived.
And we'll get to Human Rights Watch in a moment. But can we turn the clock back a little bit more, because you've already alluded to the fact that you were interested in human rights even in law school days. I know a little bit about you, Sarah Lee. I think I remember sitting on the balcony of the Ambassador Hotel in Jerusalem with you, and you just sort of dropped in a casual manner that your mum, I think, was it, that was born down the street, essentially in the old city of Jerusalem, in the Armenian Quarter.
Yes, well, close. Yes.
And then she immigrated to the US in was it 50s or 60s?
Yes.
Yeah. And so I'm just curious, did that personal history of did your family influence your interest in human rights?
Yeah. My family, and my mother in particular, 1000% influenced the work I do as a human rights lawyer, as a human rights advocate, but mostly in terms of the work I do of having empathy and compassion for people in difficult circumstances, and having just a knee-jerk reaction, a gut reaction against injustice and unfairness. My grandparents survived the Armenian genocide. My grandfather is an orphan, and to make a long story short, ended up as refugees in Jerusalem. My grandmother was a child bride, married off, as refugee children often are, basically to protect her from the dangers of being a foreigner, refugee in a strange place. But when she went to have my mother physically deliver my mother, she actually went back to the refugee camp in Lebanon, in Zahle in Lebanon, where she gave birth to my mom, and then came back to Jerusalem. So technically my mom was born in the refugee camp in Zahle in Lebanon, but for all intents and purposes grew up in Jerusalem along with her siblings until the war in 1948, when they, even though they were Armenians and Christians and living in the Christian Armenian quarter, fled because of the war and because they were, told to leave, and they did, and they went to Jordan. Then my mother came to the United States to work so that her brother could study in Los Angeles. And that was sort of the model then. That was the only reason why my mother would have justification to come to the United States. It was to support her brother so he could study and get ahead. but the notion, the experience of being a refugee, the notion of being a survivor of genocide, the notion of having to cross thousands of miles for safety and security was, very deeply ingrained in me. I went to an Armenian school in Los Angeles for 12 years. My father died when I was 2, so my mom raised me as a single parent in very difficult financial situations. And it's I knew, I don't know what the expression is, but I knew how the other shoe fit. And I had a very personal experience with the difficulties that refugee communities, immigrant communities face, people in poverty face. And that was very deeply ingrained with me. But I think part of the Armenian experience as well, and this is my good fortune of having gone to an Armenian school for 12 years, is instilling the notion that we as a people had a cause. We needed to struggle for recognition of the Armenian genocide, that there was a great injustice done, and the solution for that injustice is justice. And that was just my bread and butter growing up. This is what we learned. When there's an injustice, you struggle for justice. So, yeah.
And did that internalized struggle for justice, which was very personal, obviously, and thank you for sharing that. Did that translate into, I need to go to law school? I mean, was it that linear, that justice equals law?
I think so. I mean, I didn't know any lawyers growing up. I don't even think I knew anybody who'd gone to college growing up. Maybe my teachers in school, I suppose, but no one in my family. A much more working class community of immigrants struggling for their children. But I knew that law was the way to become a lawyer, the way to go to court, the way to fight for justice, but also the way to get into politics. It was very clear to me that politicians came from the field of law, that what politicians, particularly in the United States, did was write laws and pass laws and push laws. So I knew enough that was the direction I wanted to go in.
And you mentioned that even whilst you're at Goldman Sachs and Cleary, now flashing forward, I guess, you did some volunteering, I think, on the side, or some pro bono work. I believe some of that was with the Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee and also a feminist rights organization called Madre. Madre, excuse me.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about those organizations and those experiences.
Yeah. I must admit those were relatively small contributions that I made to both those fantastic organizations. I did a lot more volunteer work with the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And I was their general counsel pro bono for, I don't know, over 10 years, maybe 15 years. So that was the primary vehicle of my pro bono engagement, was through the center. But I did manage to do one volunteer mission with Madre to travel to Lebanon in the aftermath of conflict with Lebanon and with Israel. And because they knew I spoke Arabic, and because I'd already been involved in a lot of human rights work in the Middle East during law school in Iraq, people knew people who knew people who wanted me, therefore, to participate in the work there. And with the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, this, was, I would have to say, just at a time when there was a lot of discrimination against Arab Americans, when Islamophobia was still a growing phenomenon. And people I knew wanted to start a New York chapter of the ADC, and that's how I became involved. And it was funny because I was involved as the co-president of the New York chapter, along with Professor Asla Bali, who's Turkish and actually international law professor at UCLA. And we used to always joke with our Arab friends saying, you've got an Armenian and a Turk. heading the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee chapter, guys. Come on, we're really
It's in the name, though. We don't
Ottoman.
discriminate. That is cute.
Yeah. But I mean, it was really the Center for Economic and Social Rights and the work I did there that was the most significant human rights work that I pursued.
So you were at Cleary, you had some pro bono time, this brand new Center for Economic and Social Rights said, we need law help, and you used your pro bono time to essentially be their in-house general counsel.
I mean, and I think this might be illustrative for students watching this. That's not how it works. How it worked that I became involved with the center was because various of my Harvard Law School classmates and I, during the first Gulf War, while we were still students in law school, decided that we needed to go to Iraq and expose the impact of the war on Iraqi civilians. And we just did it. We made it happen. We took some students from the School of Public Health. We raised a little bit of money. We negotiated our way into Iraq. And we did this study about the impact of the war on civilians, which became a huge news story because the extent to which we found that the war in Iraq, the first Gulf War in Iraq, had such a devastating impact on civilians well before what anyone knew or understood or what was being reported. So some of my friends from that venture while we were at law school went on to found CESR, and I was actively participating with them, fighting with them over what the name should be and so forth.
So speaking of the name, I've got a bone to pick with you on that. What happened to cultural rights? The international treaty is economic, social, and cultural rights. How did culture drop off?
How did they let that happen? I mean, I was certainly not an international law specialist. I never took an international law course at law school. I never took a human rights law course at law school. So it was much more basic and fundamental than that. And they should have known better because they had taken those courses and written law review articles about that. But so when they founded the organization, that was my channel to have a more formal role and remain engaged in the human rights world, even while I was at the law firm.
Gotcha. And was there struggle? I mean, you need to seek permission, internally at law firms for pro bono gigs. They need to be approved. Was there any struggle in getting that?
No, because I think I just did it, on my own time. I didn't seek to bill hours to that as part of my law firm time. I mean, there's pro bono time where you kind of bill the hours, so you reflect it as your work. Where I never did that. I don't think I ever did that anyway.
And I just wanted to note for those listening that the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, MADRE, and the Center for Economic and Social Rights are all still in existence, and still doing what they do. In fact, one of the things I wanted to pick up on two things. One, the Center for Economic and Social Security, I think one of their founders was quoted as saying, what we do is social justice through human rights, as being their mantra. And it just occurs to me that, Sarah Lee, I mean, that sounds like your personal mantra. Would you be happy with that? Or?
I think so. I have never been a technician of law or someone who attributes any holy or sacred meaning to any original text or words of law. I think the law, particularly human rights law, is designed to serve a purpose and the purpose of social justice. And so if that's the vehicle we have, then that's the vehicle we'll use. There are, of course, many other vehicles for social justice. There's labor organizing, there's union driving, there's petitioning, there's civil society organizing, there's humanitarian work. There are varieties, and human rights law is one of them.
Right. Thank you for that. And then the other thing that I just wanted to pick up on something that you said was it comes to a question about funding. There's so many university students, and even just out of university, they have great ideas in human rights or international law, but they've got no money. and I think you mentioned that you pulled together a budget for a mission to Iraq. I think you just flippantly said. So I'm just curious, sort of, how the hell did you do that? Where's the guidebook on how to raise funds for a human rights mission? And two, just more generally, do you have any sort of reflections on fundraising for human rights work?
Mm-hmm. The genius of the fundraising for the work we did in Iraq while we were at Harvard Law School belongs to a very dear friend of mine called Roger Normand, and he had some connections, and he knew some people, and he knew some people who had connections with the MacArthur Foundation, and he knew some progressive people with a small family foundation, and he was able to put together a credible proposal and raise, what was it, just a tiny budget. It was really just our travel expenses. I mean, we slept on the floors of hospitals when we were in Iraq. It's not like we were staying in hotels. My role was to be the connector with the Iraqis. My role was to pave the way, because I had connections in Jordan, and I had connections in Jordan who had connection to the Iraqis. So I could, work to persuade them to allow a bunch of students from Harvard to come into their country and poke around. And, the only thing we did was call ourselves the Harvard study team. That added apparently a lot of cachet. And I always say that's the best use I ever made of that degree. And that name is to use the name we paid for and attach it to ourselves. And I'm surprised Harvard University didn't sue us for calling ourselves the Harvard study team. But it was an effective thing to do. But nowadays it's even easier. I mean, you could do GoFundMe's. There are so many small foundations, small organizations that will support you, and you don't have to travel thousands of miles away to do human rights work. And what I tell students is, you can do human rights work in your own neighborhood, in your backyard, and there are injustices, as we're seeing now with the Black Lives Matter movement, in policing in our own neighborhoods. So I would say spend as much time doing it as you do studying it.
Yeah. All right, let's shift to Human Rights Watch. I think it was 2003 or 2004 that you joined Human Rights Watch.
2004.
2004. And I think you joined as the executive director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East, North Africa division. You never, ever received a promotion in 16 years, Sarah Lee. You left as the executive director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East, North Africa division. I mean that no slight. I'm sorry, that was tongue in cheek.
No, not at all.
I couldn't think of a politically tougher, more complex, more sensitive job in international law than being the chief of a American human rights advocacy organization's Middle East, North Africa division. I mean, literally regions of the world where we've witnessed wars, atrocities, human rights abuses, even, the 21st century's first genocide, which also occurred during your tenure at Human Rights Watch. I'm referring to Darfur. Wow. You wanted to take it easy, did you?
Yeah.
Just dip your toes in?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had no idea. I had no idea what I was in for. I had no idea what we were in for in the region. Human Rights Watch was a much smaller organization with a much smaller profile. My team, I think we were 5 people or 6 people, so it wasn't what it is today. It wasn't, as all-encompassing, and I think what really changed in terms of the stresses you describe is when we reached a certain size and a certain level of prominence, there was so much expectation that we comment and speak and document everything.
Indeed.
And if we didn't,
one of the criticisms you received was a criticism of omission, that you couldn't, that you did cover one side's human rights violations, but you did cover another.
Well, that, I mean, that, of course, which is a much more politically and mendacious sort of accusation that is not sincere, compared to the more legitimate ones, where I remember some Yemeni activists came to my office and said, "Why are you not covering our country? That's not fair," and I was like, "Oh, we don't have any money. We don't," and I'm like, and they don't care that, they're like, "We're 25 million people.
Right.
We've got serious problems. So please find a way to start working in our country." And we did. And it was a great decision. I'm so glad we were able to dedicate our resources to Yemen. But, that there was this notion, if we didn't write about an activist, if we didn't write about a conflict, that was denigrating them or somehow saying there wasn't a problem. And that became a very, very big responsibility, and a responsibility that I felt very deeply.
Yeah. So I mean, you've copped criticism, you personally, Human Rights Watch, from all sides. So how do you deal with that? I mean, there must have been a level of frustration, for example, lack of budget, in the early years as well. You just couldn't be everywhere. But even in recent years, you've still copped criticism. How do you deal with that? Is that a badge of honor for you? Do you wear that with pride, or?
My experience, and I learned this from a colleague of mine, Nadim Houdi, who was my deputy director and now heads a wonderful organization called the Arab Reform Initiative. And he said, all of the people accusing us of partisanship are themselves partisans. And their only agenda in criticizing us is their partisan agenda. There is never someone who is attacking us or criticizing us that doesn't themselves have a partisan agenda. So they're accusing us of bias, but in fact, they are so deeply biased, unapologetically biased, that, and that was just true every single time in my experience. And, understanding that and realizing that, I just became very immune to it. I'm not one of those people who say, well, if we're attacked by both sides, then we must be doing something right, because that suggests that the truth is in the middle, which is bullshit, and it's not true. And no, that's not true. But rather that, at least it means they care, and at least it means we matter, and at least these partisans, these deeply biased political actors, have decided that it's worth their interest to try to silence us. Right. So for me, that's only further motivation to push harder and speak louder and also just keep changing up our game. I mean, that was one of the things I kept drumming in the last several years that I was there, which is in many cases, in ways, governments are onto us. They, the surprise factor of being outed by a Human Rights Watch report, that's gone. We're part of their sort of PR project. This is one slice of something that they have to anticipate and respond to, and so forth.
And so you have to, and so I'm curious on that. I mean, it sounds like you have to be nimble and entrepreneurial in how you do your human rights advocacy. Has it changed from like simply researching and writing a report to something different now?
I mean, I can't say it's gotten better. I will not say that the overall human rights situation in the Middle East or North Africa has gotten better thanks to my work or our advocacy. That's just patently false. The situation in the Middle East and North Africa has gotten darker and more tragic and more catastrophic in so many ways. And I'm at peace with that, and I'm comfortable with the contribution that we're making, even though things are getting worse. There are certainly areas of work where I'm very confident that our work made and has made and continues to make a profound difference. And those are the issues that are themselves subject to reform and change, because they're not ultimately political threats, existential threats.
Such as?
Such as the issue of migrant workers and modern day slavery, in the Gulf states, but also Lebanon and Jordan. Human Rights Watch was really the first organization to make that a global issue, to highlight the unbelievable abuse and exploitation of domestic workers, housemaids, but also construction workers. And I think also the first to analyze that this was not a case of bad actors, bad employers, but it was a natural outcome of systemic legalized exploitation pursuant to a system set up by these governments that allowed employers to control all facets of life of their employees with virtually no regulation. And so that's the natural outcome. If there are no stoplights and no speeding tickets, then people are going to drive as fast as they can. And similarly, if there are no regulations and the system is built to unevenly distribute power completely in the hands of employers, it's going to be exploited. And then being able to push the governments to change that through a classic name and shame strategy was possible because changing these laws was not an existential threat to the existence of the Emirati government or the Bahrainis or the Saudis for that matter.
Right. So that's a success. What were some of, if I may, sort of maybe top 3 frustrations, be it countries or issues that you've had to face?
I mean, certainly the greatest tragedy was the war and continues to be the war in Syria. And it's one that certainly amplified and developed my own political thinking about issues of humanitarian intervention, military intervention in the name of humanitarianism, and very much solidified my own opposition to US-led intervention in Syria in the name of humanitarianism. Nevertheless, even though I was opposed to a US-led military intervention in Syria, and I'm actually very happy that President Obama decided against that. I think actually it was one of the best decisions of his administration. I am very saddened and disappointed that that war became as internationalized as it did, that the Syrian people never had a chance, that the uprising in Syria, the democratic uprising in Syria, was manipulated and distorted and ruined into an international proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the US and Russia and Turkey and many of those other actors, to the great loss of the Syrian people and their beautiful country. So that has been the most heartbreaking failure, and also just the extent to which it amplified the brokenness of the international system, the manner in which the UN Security Council shields and defends, the 5 superpowers there shield and defend their client states, their cronies, whether it's the United States backing Saudi Arabia and shielding Saudi Arabia from the war in Yemen, or much more significantly, shielding Israel from any accountability or restraint. In the same way, Russia blocked and prevented accountability and restraint by Syria. And seeing that up close, even when everyone was agreeing how horrible it was, but unable to exercise a global diplomatic solution to put a stop to that, was very, very depressing.
You meant I asked for 3, but that's depressing enough, Sarah Lee. Thanks. We'll take the 1. I'm curious, though, also your the notion of justice and human rights. So, what role do you think human rights should play in resolving the Syrian conflict or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? Is human rights at the center of any solution in your mind, or is it actually we need to sort of hold our nose and have a political settlement on different terms to resolve those conflicts?
Human rights is the standard by which you're going to measure any diplomatic solution or military solution, for that matter. And ultimately, the standard is whether or not the agreement you reach or the system you put in place is one that will respect the rights of everybody under the sovereign's control, provide equality, provide justice, provide accountability. But in order to get there, you need a political solution. You need some kind of an agreement between parties to a conflict. And in the case of Syria, of course, there are multiple parties to the conflict actively fighting on the ground. And I think at this point, the question is, do the remaining parties to the conflict, let's say Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Idlib, what will happen if they're excluded from the political process? Can they be part of the political process when now they're not? As long as they have foreign governments supporting them, it can become drawn out. But at this point, I think the international proxy war that's being fought in Syria is only prolonging the war.
And where do you stand on accountability for human rights abuses, especially in these protracted conflicts? Is that, again, something that we should be pursuing at all costs, or actually for the sake of peace and stability, should we sort of, again, brush them under the carpet?
I mean, I don't think anyone's going to say, yes, let's brush them under the carpet. Accountability, like human rights, is a very big word. And I think it encompasses many, many ideas within it. There are many different forms of accountability. There's judicial accountability, which is for, Western lawyers in particular, like myself, the gold standard. You have a judge, you have lawyers, you put out the facts, you weigh it, it's according to the laws, the sentence is measured and meted out. It's all very orderly. But that rarely works out in situations of international conflict, particularly in cases of civil war. And so there are other forms of accountability. There is truth and justice mechanisms where you agree that the social harm of trying to imprison tens of thousands of accomplices, tens of thousands of people who played a role in even very vicious human rights abuses in their countries isn't feasible, isn't practical, will actually destroy the unity of the country in profound ways. And so you find other ways of having accountability. And those are very important. My own personal view is that, and this is one of the challenges of being an international organization that can issue a report and make recommendations, but isn't actually responsible for implementation, is that human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch, are sometimes take purist positions on justiciability and accountability, demanding that gold standard in all cases and never being open to compromise. That the notion that there might be a compromise solution that doesn't put people in jail, for example. And maybe that's the right role for an international human rights organization that is a standard bearer. Let the parties decide on another option, but our position is it has to be this. I think that the more, and this is not just on accountability, but the more you try to be an organization that is also focused on implementation, the more you get into the policy world and the practical things you have to do for things to work, which are not often the gold standard.
And the big C, the C word, I think, that you've been assiduously avoiding, compromise.
Oh, compromise.
No?
Is it, I don't know if you would call it compromise. I'm not a good compromiser. It's rather effectiveness. It's rather, understanding that you have priorities, understanding that you have to prioritize. And I think the closest we came to doing that, and it was an internal struggle at Human Rights Watch for us to get this report issued, for example, where we had to really persuade people that this was the right answer, was with the case of ISIS detainees in Iraq. And so the perfect answer would have been, prosecute every single one of them, anyone who is involved in any serious human rights abuse, put them in jail, the Iraqi laws, life sentence, sorry. My computer's talking to me that thinks my phone thinks I asked a question. And so the purest answer would be, justice should be meted out, jail terms, life in jail. We're talking 20, 30, 40,000 people engaged in a war.
Yeah.
Iraqis, young boys, 18, 25, this. And so what we were able to argue is that the Iraqi government should prioritize prosecuting the worst offenders responsible for the worst abuses. And for the rest, go justice, truth, and accountability. Go opportunity for victims to give their testimonies. Give opportunity for victims to be reintegrated. And that was a novel approach that Human Rights Watch did take, but it was something that we had to really think through and develop an argument for and persuade the lawyers and persuade others at the organization to go in that direction.
And we should note, I'm conscious of time, but we should note, I mean, you research, you write the reports for Human Rights Watch, but then you actually do go off and attempt to engage both publicly but also privately with country and non-state actors as well to convince them of the wisdom of your recommendations.
Yes.
It's not that you just put it out into the ether. You do some very hard advocacy work one-on-one as well.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is, in my experience, is that opportunity for direct one-on-one advocacy with governments in the Middle East and North Africa, but I think actually many governments around the world, decreased with time. And again, that's partially because governments now, it wasn't a surprise factor. They knew who we were. They knew the kind of reports we issued. They knew what, it was already factored in, whether or not they had to meet with us. But as well as more and more governments came into war and came into conflict, they stopped giving us access, stopped being willing to meet with us, shut us out of Yemen, shut us out of Israel, shut us out of Egypt, shut us out of Bahrain, shut us out of Algeria. And so the geographic space that we had, the on-the-ground space that we have to have one-on-one discussions with government officials, not just the ambassadors who will say anything and can deliver nothing, but the actors on the ground has grown much more limited with time. And that's a real disappointment because it's actually was a learning experience to hear things from their perspective. But everything in the Middle East, particularly after the Arab uprisings of 2011, became an existential threat to these governments. And back to the question you were asking me, the other disappointment and realization was the extent to which the US government continued to support and continues to support some of the worst actors in the region, the most abusive actors in the region. And, and their calculation of, we don't need to talk to you, we don't need to meet with you. Obama's already on our side supporting the war in Yemen. Egypt, Sisi is Trump's favorite dictator. Israel, we have, Pompeo standing on occupied ground, delivering a message to the RNC. So that, I think it's always been my assessment that the US is not a good actor in the Middle East. But that view, that perception based on my on-the-ground experience and observation has certainly solidified and hardened.
And are you overall then, given that experience, that life experience, are you hopeful, are you optimistic, or are you pessimistic about human rights in the Middle East, North Africa region?
It's short-term, long-term. What's your horizon point? I don't know about optimism. Optimism is a really hard thing to have in this day and age. It's hard to have in America right now. It's hard to have in American cities where yet another African American was shot, with 7 bullets as he was trying to enter his car with his children in there. Are we optimistic about police reform? You asked me this today, and I don't know. I don't know if I'm optimistic. But what I am optimistic about, and it's not really optimism, it's an observation, it's that for every human born, there is in us an innate desire for fairness and justice. And these are the natural things to teach our children. And it's a natural thing everybody wants. They want to be treated fairly. They want to be treated with respect. They want to be treated with dignity. They don't want to feel like a subject. And so no matter where or what, you're always going to have a next generation of people who make that demand known, who will push for what's true and what's right. It can't be snuffed out. You can snuff out the entire human race, which may well happen, but you can't snuff out that human instinct.
So speaking of that human instinct, Sarah Lee, an opportunity for you to talk about perhaps your next venture, which by the time this airs, you will have officially launched. Dawn, Democracy in the Arab World Now.
Yes.
Can you spend 30 seconds? What is it? Who founded it? What's it all about? How do we get involved?
Sure. Dawn was founded by Jamal Khashoggi, a friend of mine and a longtime colleague and collaborator over many years. Probably the first person I met in the Saudi embassy that when I visited back in 2004 or 5 in Washington. Founded by him as an organization to continue to promote and push for democracy and rights in the Arab world. Our goal, our vision is that we believe that democracy and human rights are the only solution for the region, the only solution that will have security and stability and dignity for the people of the region. Nothing else will work. There may be shortcuts, but they won't last because they go against those human instincts that I was mentioning. And what we're seeking to do is to demonstrate to the governments in the region that by silencing one exile, Jamal Khashoggi, by brutally murdering him, they have not silenced the demand and the call for rights and justice and freedom in the Middle East and North Africa. And we hope to be a vehicle for thousands of exile voices, people from the Arab world, people from the Middle East who struggled and have sacrificed to build a better future for the region and have now been exiled from their countries. We want to harness their energy back to that mission, to focus on that mission. We also want to focus very carefully on the enablers, on the complicit government officials who make the abuse and oppression possible. You know, we always hear about the Sisis of this world and the MBSs of this world, but you never hear about the judges who enforce these laws. You never hear about the prosecutors who carry out sham trials and sham investigations. You never hear about the prison wardens who deprive these prisoners of basic dignities in their detention.
Right.
And so
the
we want to
instruments
shine
of policy, the enablers.
Close spotlight on these people, while amplifying the voices of exiles and experts for a new vision for the region.
And for those listening or viewing, the link, the website for Dawn will be in the podcast description.
Yes.
So
dawnmena.org.
dawnmena.org. Lightning round, Sarah Lee. I'm conscious we've got a hard deadline. So lightning round, if I may, take a few more minutes of your time. Short, 25-word answers, if that. Does international law work?
Not usually, but we have to keep trying.
Heroes, people that have come before you that you draw inspiration from in your human rights work?
Oh, absolutely. So many to remember, but you know, the heroes I think of are often the unnamed, unknown people who have taken personal risks with little personal gain. The people who are marching in the streets of Cairo, demanding change in their government. The people who took bullets in Syria, 18-year-old, 20-year-old kids wanting democracy and freedom for their country. Those are my heroes.
Best book you've ever read on human rights or international law?
Oh,
fiction,
gosh.
non-fiction, doesn't matter.
You know, I'm just not good with titles, but the memoir by Hisham Matar, which I think won a Pulitzer Prize, about his father's disappearance in Libya and the impact that had on him and his family, was one of the most poignant and beautiful and deeply moving books that I read that pertain to our region and the struggle in our region.
And favorite international law / human rights movie?
Oh, gosh.
And favorite, I don't mean, you know, sitting there with popcorn and having a laugh, but, you know, the most poignant or most special.
So many, but
for you.
one, I mean, I don't know if it's the most, but I'll say I think that one movie that really shocked me and opened my eyes to something I had no idea about. Well, there were a couple, certainly. One was Waco, Terms of Engagement, about the Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco's raid into the Waco compound in Texas against what they called a cult, a religious cult. This unbelievable, brutal attack on peaceful community, and even if it wasn't a peaceful community, a heavy-handed assault that led to multiple unnecessary deaths, and then defended and justified by government officials, including Chuck Schumer, who I remember played the bulldog, interrogating the victims of Waco when they came to testify before Congress. It was a real eye-opening account of government overreach here in the United States.
Looking at history, your favorite international law moment in history? Again,
I can't think of absolutes the way you say, favorite, best, and so forth. But what comes into mind, an international law moment that comes to mind, is when Palestine ratified the Rome Statute and joined the ICC. It was something that we had been urging the Palestinian officials, President Abbas, to do for such a long time. There's another book or paper to be written on why they took so long to do it, but they did. But finally seeing them take that measure, seeing them take that lever of accountability in their hands, I just remember, whooping with joy that they had taken that move.
Yeah. Fill in the gap. International law is 3 words.
International law is the best hope we have for multilateral, peaceful, justiciable solutions for people around the world.
Another fill in the gap. There ought to be an international law about
honking.
Honking?
Cars should not have their
we need an international
horns.
law about honking. Okay.
I'm just being flippant. If you hit a horn, it should blast as loudly in your own car as it does outside. So you really think twice before you honk that horn.
Fantastic. And my final question, Sarah Lee, there's a lot of students of international law that are going to be viewing this. What advice would you give them if they want to pursue a career in international law, in human rights?
I would say, think beyond the law. Think about if you really are in the international domain and want to do something abroad, really get to know the place, get to know the people, learn the language, live there, be there, eat the food, drink the water. There is a level of experience and understanding that only comes when you're not in COVID, when you're on the ground, and when you are in a place for chance encounters that will shape and determine the way you see everything. There's an education that can't be had in books. So don't just think about the degrees and the classes and the treatises. Think about the people, think about the human beings, and building and developing real relationships, and understanding the perspective of people who you ostensibly want to help or serve. Be there.
Yeah. Sarah Leah Whitson, we are way out of time. I just want to wish you the best of luck with Dawn and congratulate you on an amazing tenure at Human Rights Watch. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for your contributions to making the world a better place.
Thank you for having me. It's so lovely to see you after all these years.
Yes, and thank you for that mentorship and that internship way back when. Look at me now.
Who knew?
Yeah, who knew?
All right.
Take care.